Did you know that Inferno was initially supposed to be located in Seiya, or that Theater of Blood was supposed to have brand new best in stat range gloves, but they failed at 74.9%, missing out on just 0.1% of votes from entering the game. There is a lot of interesting trivia about Oldschool Runescape updates that for one reason or another never passed the development stage. So today I want to show you the most interesting stories, what went wrong, and how would Oldschool Runescape look like today if these updates did make it into the game. And with that, let's start the video. Since we already briefly mentioned Inferno, let's start with that one. The year is 2017. JX had just released the very first raid into Oldschool Runescape, and they were putting a lot of effort into making Seiya a continent filled with content. So at the beginning of 2017, Jagex came out with a blog about the Brimstone village west of Kourend, where the nefarious Inferno will spawn. In this blog, they firstly talked about a brimstone thieving method, which was later turned into pickpocketing the char creatures. Interestingly enough, the char thieving method on release gave more profit and experience than any other thieving method in the game, but that was quickly hotfixed on the same exact day, as it was simply too much loot and you could get upwards of 300,000 experience an hour with this method. But that wasn't the only thing you can get from the Brimstone village. It also offered brimstone fishing, which later on was turned into infernal eels, and it offered the Galit armor, which later was changed to obsidian armor. Funnily enough, players in 2017 were not very interested in the infernal cape. At the time, players were still learning the ropes of the game, and getting a fire cape was a big achievement, so making it even more difficult and promoting it as the hardest piece of content in Oldschool Runescape was just not everyone's cup of tea. One Reddit comment said this: "I don't like that this cape is better than the fire cape. Can't we just make this cape best in slot for range and magic?" And the one below that says, "Yeah, we totally need to hit 45s with Ice Barrage." Oh, how the times have changed over the years. So, the devs take in all the feedback and decide to release an updated blog 2 days later, stating that thematically it makes much more sense that the Inferno is related to the existing Tsar city rather than standalone concept in a land far far away. They construct the city itself, which, by the way, interesting trivia, the city of Mol Ul Rek you see in the game today is actually designed by a player, which was actually kinda cool to see, and I'll show you a few other player made updates later on in this video as well. But for Inferno it was time to send it for a poll. Interestingly, Jagex polled Inferno 1 year earlier in 2016, and that poll absolutely failed, mainly because it was just called Jad 2, like a continuation to a questline or a sequel to an iconic movie, rather than standalone content that the Inferno is today. So the expectations 1 year later in 2017 were kinda the same. There was a very large group of players who didn't like an upgrade to the iconic fire cape. Luckily this time around the concept was much better explained, and the idea of bringing in the hardest content that Oldschool Runescape has ever seen was enough to convince majority of players to vote yes. And in June 2017, Inferno entered the Oldschool Runescape, which now, 7 years later, is still considered one of the best pieces of content that's ever been released in the game. I quickly want to mention that we are so close to 30,000 subscribers, so if you enjoyed any part of my content and want to support me, consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much. Let's continue. With the success of quests like Dragon Slayer 2 and minigames like Inferno, Jagex felt great about releasing content that was hard to tackle but felt very rewarding once it's completed. In many players' eyes, the 2017-2018 period is considered one of the best in the game's history, because even though the content was scarce, the quality was extremely high. And that's when the initial idea for Raids 2 also came into play. Some players say it was piggybacked from the success of Chambers in 2017, but to me it felt like the natural next step of progression, just like in any MMO. Once a game has been out for 5 years, it does make sense to start adding more and more endgame content to satisfy players who have worked very hard to get there. Initially, Theater of Blood was supposed to have 14 different types of rewards, but a lot of them just weren't much liked by the players. There was a prayer scroll similar to scrolls from Chambers that was called the Judgment Scroll, and it required 85 prayer. The idea was that it was an overhead prayer that boosts your attack and strength by 10% and lowers your defense by 50%, and 1/6 of all the damage you deal is removed from your prayer points. So if you hit a 60 with a God Sword, you would lose 10 prayer points immediately. The caveat was that since it's an overhead prayer like protection prayers, you can use this alongside with piety, so the actual damage increase would have been 33%. Players were divided by the scroll, because despite it giving total total of 33% damage boost, it seemed not so good. Mostly because you lose protection prayers, which are a must in any piece of hard content in the game. Interestingly enough, Jagex also promoted these 3 sets of armor during a live stream, and it was hinted that they were at one point supposed to be rewards from Theater of Blood. But after the blogs came out, they were scrapped until of course Nightmare Boss came out, and the armor made a comeback, which is now called the Inquisitor set. But there were few other rewards that also didn't make the cut, like there was a potion that was supposed to restore your prayer points and stamina at the same time. The other potion that also didn't make the final rewards was a super prayer potion, and this one restores your prayer and also adds a prayer renewal effect that restores additional 6 points over time. Both of these received roughly 72% yes votes, but since the vote change at the time required 75 to pass, this unfortunately never made it in. And the final reward that didn't make it in was the best in slot range Vambraces, which received a whopping 74.9% of yes votes and missed out by just 0.1%. Luckily, only 4 years later, Jagex released them into the game anyways and even made them stronger than they initially were by adding extra attack and prayer bonuses. They are now called Sarite Vambraces, so I guess the lesson here is try again until you succeed. Once everything was set in stone, it was time for a ball. Keep in mind that Chambers of Serich Challenge Mode was released just 2 months before Theater of Blood, and the feedback from that was extremely positive, so the expectations for this next raid were sky high. And that showed in the ball as well, because almost 90% of players voted yes on Theater of Blood. I've asked a few people in my community who have extensively done all 3 raids for hundreds of KC, and the answer is unanimously the same. Theater of Blood is the best raid in Oldschool Runescape. Nevertheless, I imagine the raid would be slightly more popular if it had 14 rewards in total, like Jagex polled at the time, but I guess we'll never find out. Next up, I want to talk about raiding posts. Older generation of players remember the first days of Oldschool Runescape and how everything was traded by players to players. There was no GE, there was no systems in place to track trades, and there was nothing to track the actual value of items. It was just made up on the spot. I remember I wanted to train Herblore on the first week, and I had to buy unidentified herbs because it was the only way to get any experience. And the idea was that you get all sorts of different herbs, and they're all 1k each. Once you identify them, some are qualms, which are worth less, some are ranars, which are worth more, but the general value of items should come to approximately 1k each. Apparently, few players figured out the ID codes for bad herbs and then sold them in bulk for 1k each. So if you weren't careful, you just got a bunch of qualms and marantils, which at the time were valued at like 100 GP each. But by the time you figured that out, the trader was long gone. These were one of the many scams pulled in the initial year of the game, and Jagex wanted to come up with a solution to prevent that. Now keep in mind that in 2013, players were full on riding the nostalgia wave. This was it. This was Oldschool Runescape, and it was never gonna change. No updates, no new fancy technology, and every day the same sentence was carried out. We don't want anything, which honestly now has matured like fine milk. So when Jagex initially proposed Grand Exchange, players said immediately, no way Jose, we don't want that, trading in Varrock Center for hours is what it's all about. But as time went on, more players got frustrated that they spent more and more of their valuable time just finding people to trade rather than actually playing the game. If you have a game as big as RuneScape, spending half of your time in one location trading others gets boring very fast. And that's when Jagex came up with an idea for an auction house, which was just a mustache and a fake nose put on top of the GE. And guess what? Suddenly players absolutely loved it. This is not the GE, this is something entirely different, Jagex said. The idea was simple. Players want to obtain items quickly without spending hours trading others. Players also want to trade others while they're offline. And finally, players want to see actual prices of items before trading them over. Essentially, the idea was that anyone can put up their offer into the auction house. Other people can see those offers, they can see the person who sells, the price, the quantity, and then make a decision if they want to buy that. So they poll it, and to the surprise of many, it actually did pass, which was probably a mistake in hindsight. You see, firstly, Jagex and the players wanted to keep some type of player interaction with the trading post. So when someone was selling an item, their name was behind that item, and you had to add them to your friend list and still make an offer through that. However, what ended up happening was the opposite. You had occasions like this where a player put up an offer 2 minutes ago and then just turned their private off, so nobody could reach him and the offer meant nothing. Or maybe it was just a flex on 2 farming seeds. Sometimes you wanted to add 10 players just to get a rune pickaxe, which just simply wasn't possible because everyone had their private turned off. Just 1 week after it was released, people already gave up on trading posts and just went back to selling items on third-party sites like Cybers or stick to Varrock West Bank. I honestly think part of it was just Jagex finding the worst possible way to trade other players, so when they see the trading post their immediate thought is like, hey, you know what? Maybe GE isn't as bad as they say it is. And guess what? It worked once again. The trading post lasted for a few weeks before Jagex completely removed it because players just didn't like it at all and they replaced it with the GE we still see today. It was definitely one of the most fascinating disasters that ever happened in Oldschool Runescape, and looking back it's kinda cool to see how the team was just experimenting with all sorts of crazy updates until something worked out. And the final topic I want to mention because I left the best for the last, which is the player designed content, or PDC as Jagex likes to call it. In the first year of Oldschool Runescape coming out, Jagex had 3 people working on the project, which meant that there was just physically no way to pump out content in a rate that makes players happy. So Mod Ash and Mod Matt K came up with an idea to let players design their own pieces of content. The very first version of that was Rooftop Agility, which was added 11 years ago. However, back then it was just called Roof Leaping Agility Reborn, which honestly sounds like a name made up in ChatGPT. But at the time when Rooftop Agility did get implemented, it was a widely popular update that made players very happy. Since it was so successful, Jagex made another one, and this time the winner was Motherlode Mine. Same concept, same idea, and entirely made by a player. But alongside rooftop courses and Motherlode Mines, there were dozens of great player-made ideas that never saw the light of day. For example, one of my personal favorites was construction shortcuts. The idea was that outside your own POH and very few quests, construction doesn't really have much use. You just build the same thing over and over again until you get 99 construction, and then never touch the skill again. These construction shortcuts would be built with planks and nails depending on the level of the shortcut, and would work in a similar way like agility does. And finally, my favorite was Flaming Arrows update, which was fire making expansion based on combat. The idea was simple. You can already make flaming arrows in underground pass quest, but this would actually incentivize players to use them outside the quest as well. You would need to use a cloth and a tinderbox to make the flaming arrows, and it would have a slight bonus compared to the normal arrows alongside with a special effect. So let's say rune arrows have 49 range strength. This would bump it up to 54, plus it had a paralyzing effect, which has a chance to entangle your opponent for a small duration, like 3 seconds. The arrows would be untradeable and you had to make them yourself. So for example, making bronze arrows requires 30 fire making, but making rune flaming arrows would require 80 fire making. It would incentivize players to train their skills up to gain more combat benefit out of it. This and many others were concepts that were so close to coming into Oldschool Runescape at some point, but just slightly missed out on few votes from entering the game. So now I want to hear from you. Would you be interested in seeing some of these updates in the game? Was there anything that specifically caught your attention? Let me know down in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing to help me out. But that's it, I love you all very much, and I'll see you all tomorrow with another video. Bye!